One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy krausen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. My family loves teppanyaki. Birthdays, Father's Days, and numerous other celebratory days are often spent around a hot griddle, the chef tossing fiery sticks and making onion volcanoes to entertain us while we await our food. It's during these times that I indulge in what I truly believe is the only proper beverage to pair with fried rice, steak, and spicy shrimp. You're listening to the Brewlosophy podcast. I am your host, Marshall Schott, and on this episode, I'm joined by contributor Malcolm Fraser to chat about a beer style known as International Pale Lager.
I love international pale lagers in kind of an odd way. So I love dad beer. You'll often hear me talk about hams or whatever the local favorite is. U.S. or post-prohibition had all these little tiny local breweries everywhere, and then they still kind of exist. Even though they might be owned by a larger company.
Right.
Well, the same thing happens all throughout Europe and Latin America. Every area has this essentially a macro lager that's popular, and it's all based off of, it's like a tweener between Helles and Pilsner. It can kind of skirt the line, and depending on which area and local tastes, it'll go more malty or more bitter or more dry,
sure, etc.
And they usually take advantage of local adjuncts.
Yeah.
And nothing's better than going to some country X and drinking those in mass. So it's like if you go to Latin America, some resort, you drink whatever, is the popular beer there. If you're in Jamaica, of course, you have Red Stripe.
Red Stripe, that's right.
Yeah. If you're in Japan, you're drinking Kirin or Asahi, whatever, Tiger in Nepal, I think it is. And so, they're all more or less the same. And I think a lot of times you could switch them out and not tell someone. But when you start really paying attention, they do kind of lean one way or another. This one's more malty, this one's more dry, this one's more bitter.
Yeah.
So I really like that. I
really
appreciate it. And you can drink just tons of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the key, right? And it's been my experience that craft examples of International Pale Lager are pretty difficult to find. I think a part of that is because of how similar it is to other pale lagers that also happen to be viewed as largely the domain of big beer. Of course, the commonly known versions being mostly corporate owned, they tend to yield quite a bit of hate from those who, I guess, are more deeply rooted in the craft beer world, if you will. Personally, this doesn't bother me, and I still enjoy the occasional Moosehead or Sapporo. Having never brewed an International Pale Lager myself, I recently gave it a shot using short and shoddy methods. We're going to be discussing those results in this episode as well. All right. If you like what we're up to and you want to help to keep us doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with someone in the brewing world. We are currently populating the list for 2020. I think people will be quite pleased with who we end up going with. Past guests have included folks like Chop and Brew's Chip Walton, who was just on this last weekend, Vinny Chilurzo from Russian River, hop expert Dr. Tom Shellhammer, and so many more. All past sessions are available on our private Facebook page, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who have an array of amazing purpose-built stainless brewing products to improve your brew day. If you're looking for a high-quality pilot brewery, make sure to check out their BH15 single-tier system. This thing is absolutely gorgeous. It comes with a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Head over to brewershardware.com to see what they're all about, and make sure to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Listener David Evans wrote in with a comment on last week's episode regarding adding gelatin at yeast pitch. He said, I used to use collagen and gelatin in my research and may have an explanation for why gelatin works better at cold crashing. When you drop the temperature of the beer, you make it significantly less soluble, which forces many of the dissolved proteins out of solution, similar to how chill haze works. When those proteins are forced out of solution, they are then more accessible for the oppositely charged gelatin to bind to and then fall out of solution. When you add the gelatin before cold crashing, I assume the gelatin can only bind the proteins already knocked out of solution, and by the time it gets cold crashed, the gelatin has already fallen to the bottom of the vessel. Then, when you serve the beer colder than the temp at which you find with gelatin, new proteins become undissolved, making it hazy again. What do you think, Malcolm?
So gelatin is positively charged, and it works best at attracting yeast, which is negatively charged. So gelatin is not typically a great finer for proteins. It does work in some regard, and if you get really deep into fining tech info, you'll see that it's not purely a polarity. There's other binders. But typically, big breweries will use auxiliary finings for proteins in polyphenol hazes. Things
that'll like chop up those proteins to make them easier to drop out, or?
Well, you can use enzymatic, which is the chopping up, right, or you can use attractive polarities again. So, or proline binders. So at the end of a particular fining can have a proline end, and it's attractive to the opposite side. So what would happen here would be you would use something like Biofine Clear or Algenex, or some negatively charged fining, and then that would attract to the positively charged proteins.
Right.
And then you would follow that up in a two-stage process with a positively charged fining, such as isinglass or gelatin.
Right. What's interesting to me is that I've used all of those. I've never used isinglass, but I've used Clarity Firm, Biofine, gelatin many times, and the one that works the best, and for whatever reason, is the gelatin. It's also the quickest, but I've heard that argument as well, that doubling up, you're going to attack basically two things, and just kind of ensures that. But it does make sense what David is saying here, that if you're adding gelatin at yeast pitch, so prior to cold crashing, that it's binding to the stuff that's already there and kind of it taps out, I guess. So your guess is as good as mine. David sounds like he's got some expertise in this, so perhaps that is what it is. Thank you for the feedback, David. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. So back in October, I had the incredible opportunity to speak at the 2019 BrewCon in Dublin, Ireland. It was such an awesome event. Got to hang out with Ron Pattinson and some other folks. Well, my wife joined me. It was our first trip to Ireland ever, and we decided to make a vacation of it. We rented a car and drove around the country for a week, learning how to drive on the wrong side of the car. On the wrong side of the road was a hoot, I'll tell you. But one of our last stops was the city of Athlone in County Westmeath. We hadn't actually planned on stopping there, but decided last minute after Liam Tuddy, owner of and head brewer at Dead Center Brewing, reached out and invited us to his place. I am so glad that we made this stop. The food was fantastic, and the beer was easily some of the best that I had the entire trip. Being the awesome guy that Liam is, he sent me home with some treats, one of which was a can of Dead Center's Marooned IPA, which I shared with my buddies.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Very hazy.
That's an IPA.
Oh, yeah. We don't have to drink it.
No, we do have to drink it. Because if it's an IPA, it's good.
Yeah, do we really?
Oh, it's good. Oh, so good to me. You don't like it? Why?
Because after I finish drinking it, it continues to linger in my mouth.
Good reason. Once more. Tell me why. All of these reasons you don't like IPA.
It's juicy.
It's juicy should be enough for you.
It is good. The first I got over the initial.
Oh, it's good.
And it is good. And I hate them.
It's good. It's just so this is a pure.
It's very floral.
Pure IPA flavor. Like all I taste is what makes an IPA an IPA. I don't taste any bullshit from the sides. Just clean in the middle. This is IPA.
What I don't like, and how I always describe juniper and whatever. It's just it smells like that to me.
So if I want to be like, hey, have you ever had an IPA? And someone's like, no, something like this would be good. just IPA.
But it is very juicy.
Why? I give it 10 jerseys, bordering on 3.2 million.
I'm just going to stop at 7 for a total of
3.2 million.
Despite traveling on airplane from Ireland to California, then sitting in my fridge for over a month awaiting our tasting session, this can of marooned IPA was very nice. It tasted very good to me, held up quite well. It was a lower ABV IPA, which is something that I've noticed about like European examples in general of IPA. They tend to be more in the 5 to 6% range. Whereas us Americans tend to go a little bit higher. But I felt like it had some really pleasant qualities that perhaps were contributed by the dose of Red X malt they used. And also with the marooned IPA, they kind of advertise it as having being made with a good charge of local Irish oats as well. To me, it just had a really classic, well done IPA flavor. So I'm glad the guys liked it, or at least Jersey did, and Tim came around.
Yeah, I don't know. Just, not much descriptors, as is their way, other than he liked it. And then once again, like Tim coming in with the juniper.
Yeah, you couldn't leave that one out. Yeah.
No.
Have you ever used Red X malt? Because that's one of the malts that they say is they use a decent amount of in this beer.
I've used Cara Red. I don't think I've used Red X. No.
Either have I. I've read about it though. I read about red malt. Apparently you can use it up to 100% of the grist, and it'll self-convert and all that stuff. So I'm not sure how much they used in this marooned. I think that's why it got its name, perhaps, because it had kind of a nice maroon reddish color. But the local Irish oats that they used really did give it kind of a smooth mouthfeel, in my opinion, and held up the hops that they used quite well. So hugely thanks to Liam Tuddy for being such an awesome host to us at Dead Center Brewing in Athlone, Ireland. If ever you're in the area, you have to go to this place. It's really, really cool. If you want your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. All right, when we return from this break, the focus will be on International Pale Lager. We'll be right back. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exchillerator.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Want to brew quality craft beer at home? The Grainfather provides a brewing system with superior design, innovative features, and the latest technology, allowing you to brew professional quality craft beer at home. Mash, sparge, boil, and cool all in one unit, meaning there's less equipment to use, clean, and store. No need for burners or hot plates. Just plug it in and brew great beer. Then get the best out of your fermentation with the Grainfather conical fermenters and glycol chiller. Plus, enhance your brewing experience with the brand new free-to-use Grainfather community app. You can take your brewing tools and your recipes with you everywhere, use brewing calculators on the fly, manage your recipes, and monitor your brew session from anywhere. Use your mobile device to manage your Grainfather brew wirelessly, automate mash schedules, and multitask without removing any of the brewing hands-on fun. Grainfather products can all be found at www.grainfather.com. Plus, as a Brewlosophy podcast listener, get 10% off your order. Just use discount code Brewlosophy19 at checkout. That's BRULosophy19 to receive 10% off your order. So head to shop.grainfather.com now to get this great deal. There are very few types of beer I can say I was drinking with any regularity prior to being of age. I think I've mentioned it before, but Bud Ice was my go-to. I think it's because it was cheap and packed a punch. However, for whatever reason, perhaps proximity or whatever, there always seemed to be Moosehead available at the wholesome functions that I was attending as a high schooler and early college student. I developed a genuine appreciation for that beer, which is technically considered an international pale lager. Now, this is a pretty odd style to me because pretty much any mass market pale lager that's not produced in the United States is considered, quote, international. Malcolm, you're kind of our resident style expert. Maybe you could shed some light on the history of this amoebic style for us.
Well, I mean, the history is just, it winds all the way back to the creation of pale lagers in general. So Bavaria initially had darker beers, popular for their dunkels and such.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I think we've gone over the story. A lot of brewers have heard the story of, the creation of Bohemian Pils or Czech lager, using lighter kilned malt to make use of the soft water in Czechoslovakia, in modern day Czechoslovakia. So, when that became popular, it kind of resonated throughout Europe and then carried over to the U.S. So from that, I think Spaten Brewery created the Helles, right? And then there was the German Pilsners, and then as those immigrants came over and populated the U.S., they brought their local pale lager with them, and they started making these American versions of this international pale lager, and they became, the American lagers and American light lagers.
Right.
But back home, all throughout Europe, and this is, Eastern and Western Europe, there was a call for, a light, fizzy, moderately flavored, mostly highly attenuated beer. And so every place had more or less, had a large brewery making this style. And they usually took advantage of, the hops they had available, whatever malt was available, and whatever adjuncts were available. So if you were in Asia, you probably had rice in it,
right.
So of some form, either a cereal mash or rice solids or flaked rice. And you might even use local rice. So, in Japan, you use Japanese varieties of rice. If you were in Southeast Asia, you might use a sticky rice, a glutinous rice, which is kind of neat, because the beer can kind of take on that flavor.
Sure.
And Western Europe, and especially in Americas, if not to conflate the two, but Americas were heavy on corn, but they were using corn in some places in Central Europe as well.
Yeah. I've gone through it's new to us, right? The 2015 BJCP guidelines. I got my BJCP cred 2008 guidelines, but as I was going through it and looking at this, I couldn't help but think, they've got this, it was considered important enough to include as its own category in the BJCP guidelines, International Pale Lager. And, taking a step back and looking at it, I'm going, all right, so you've got pale lager from pretty much every spot on earth. There are people making a pale lager version of beer. In America, we've got all of the different American style pale lagers. You cross the border into Canada, or you go south into Mexico, and all of a sudden now you've got international pale lager. And I'm looking at them going, they're basically the same beers. It's just they're not made in America. And I guess that was the part that I got a little bit hung up on in my own studying of it all. Is it a category that's based just specifically on not being made in the U.S.? Because we seem to clump. I mean, why don't we include, for example, German Pilsner as being an international pale lager? Because it sort of is. I mean, it's a pale lager that's not made in America. And I get that German Pilsner has its own distinct, way of being made and characteristics that you can expect to get from that beer. But I guess, knowing Gordon Strong as well as you do, I was just, maybe you don't know, but I'm just wondering what it was about this specific category that made it want to be distinct, made them want to make it distinct from other styles. Why not just call it something like, pale, adjunct laden pale lager, something like that?
Well, I haven't had that specific question with Gordon. Obviously, Kristen England had a lot of influence on the 2015 too. and I haven't talked to, I don't know him super well, but we've conversed mostly via the web, but internet. But I think it becomes a matter of convenience. You have to kind of lump things in together. And are you going to have a pale lager for every single country? So I think it's just kind of like a catch-all.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the commercial examples, it's Asahi Super Dry, Birra Moretti, Corona.
Yeah. All of which taste totally different.
Yeah. Heineken, Red Stripe, Singhai. Then there's two from the U.S. Full Sail and Devil's Backbone and Gold Leaf, Full Sail Session Premium Lager. So those are pretty much cover the globe almost, and I think they're just trying to say it's pale, it's mostly highly attenuated, typically balanced, but then you can kind of tweak one or two areas, so if you think of it as the Beersmith model with you have like the color, the alcohol, and then of course flavor and aroma is not in those slider bars, but you could say, well, I can skirt the edge on this one, and that's kind of what they do over in Japan. They kind of make them drier to appease local palate. And maybe, if you use Birra Moretti or Peroni, which is one of my favorites when it's fresh.
Oh, I love it too.
Peroni can be quite good, and they use specific corn for theirs. So that's taking on that character. Well, those aren't as dry. They're more malty and grainy, and I like those too. So they kind of all have their own little thing. I think Red Stripe tends to be a little more caramely. I mean, it's not caramel bomb, but it has a little more of a sweetness to it.
Yeah.
So, but they all have that same. It's like you can identify it as like that's a dog. Hey, that's a dog.
It's a
not
different
cat.
species of international pale lager. Yeah.
Yeah. So the same thing. It's like I've just used an example in a class I gave where it's like, when does a beagle become a foxhound? So it's like it's taller. It has shorter ears.
Right.
So they're all in that same vein. And they're usually mass produced. In an industrial brewery, and sometimes a multinational owned brewery. So it could fall under the envelope of the evil empires that people like to malign. But
right.
I mean, Heineken has its hands. Like the one I just mentioned in the leadoff is I said Nepal because I always think Nepal Tiger. It's actually Singapore, but Tiger. Yeah. I think it's still part of Heineken.
Tiger.
Tiger.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. I'm not sure if that's how accurate that is.
Yeah, but that's how it is. So each country are and sometimes within certain areas of countries have this big brewery that it's the beer you drink while you're watching sports or you're at a picnic or when you want more than three of. So.
Well, and I love how you mentioned the Beersmith thing, because that's exactly how I kind of forced myself to think about international pale lager. You contrast it to something like German Pilsner, which the way I view German Pilsner is it has a fairly specific, for lack of a better term, requirements, right? You expect certain things from it. It's going to have a more assertive or noticeable bitterness. It's going to have a very noticeable noble hop character to it. So there's these components to a German Pilsner that are quite fine and easy to get out of if you don't do it right. Whereas with international pale lager, to me, I kind of view those as being a bit more broad on all those levels. So maybe the one thing that would remain the same is the appearance. You're expecting it to be really light yellow and clear, crystal clear in my opinion for this style. But then you move down to things like aroma and flavor. And to me, it's almost like there's these parentheses on the outside of what that can be, and that range is a bit bigger. The aroma could be, like you were saying, Red Stripe, I experienced the same thing. Red Stripe does tend to be a bit more caramelly to me, but not like sickly sweet. And Corona, if you've never had a Corona, I don't believe you, first off, but secondly, Corona has a very distinct Corona flavor. You drink that next to a Moosehead or next to a
it's
Heineken.
called 3MBT. It's skunked.
It's skunked, yeah. Well, and I've heard that they tried bottling it in brown bottles, and they had to go back to clear because it was, it didn't work out for them. But those characteristics define those styles, and yet, or those beers, but yet they're all still clumped in the same style. So it creates this range within which you can, I guess that you can make this beer, have it be a part of that style, but it's still going to be different. There's an argument that somebody gave me when I was talking about this international pale lager with them recently, where they said, "Well, where did you brew the beer?" I said, "In my garage here in Fresno, California." They were like, "Then it's not an international pale lager. You're modeling it after one, but you're basically just making an American pale lager."
I don't know. Who cares? That's an argument worth not even having. It's like, what does it taste like?
But that's the thing.
What does it look like?
It's. I don't think any arguments are necessarily worth having in the beer world. But
is Full Sail Session Premium Lager not an international?
I was
going to
bring that up as well.
Technically not, right? It's an American premium lager, maybe.
Well, and that's the thing is, what would you do differently to an international pale lager? That you wouldn't do in an American premium lager. I mean, to me, it's so similar that it's that line is so fuzzy between the two which is why I ask, and maybe we're going down a rabbit hole here. Was the inclusion of international pale lager just to kind of pay homage to the fact that these people outside of the U.S. are also making this style of beer?
Well, so if you wanted to call it like an American or American premium, those tend to be a little more malt balanced. So the Europeans and their international pale lager tends to be more bitter, so they'll creeping up in like the 25 IBU range.
Sure.
Into my perception, but they're and they're also not as flavorful. So the American lagers tend to be more austere, whereas we were talking about this caramel character, for a Red Stripe or Tiger, and then if you go to Japan, they're very, very dry, so they have less IBU, analytically, but perceptively they're somewhat bitter because they're so well attenuated.
How dry they are, yeah.
And I remember when I was in Hawaii in my Chinese and Korean, they're Chinese and Korean couple. She was telling me like, oh yeah, we don't like, and she was speaking as if she was speaking for her country. She was like, we don't like bitter beers. And I'm thinking like, yeah, your beers are kind of bitter, but she's thinking like IPAs and stuff like that,
Yeah.
And I remember having that conversation with her. I'm like, yeah, they're not like super bitter, but they're bitter to the taste.
Yeah.
And especially because they have hot bitterness and they have this carbonated bitterness, that bite, that snap, The other thing too is American lager versus international pale is the American lagers don't tend to have late hop character, and the international pales can. They don't all, but some of them do.
Sure. Well, and the other thing that I always think is interesting when thinking about this style, and we'll kind of move into how what ingredients are typically used in this style. But you go down to Mexico and you line up a Corona and a Pacifico, and a Sol next to each other, all international pale lagers, all that taste, in my opinion, quite a bit different as well. So again, something that I appreciate about the category of international pale lagers, just how broad it is. It's not like a fine microscopic, style like German Pilsner or whatever else. So which makes it a lot of fun to brew because you can kind of have a little bit of fun within those bounds and still call it, without getting too much flack, an international pale lager, which is kind of fun.
Well, one of the things I find funny is like, so it's easy to sit here and say, oh yeah, a German Pils is more narrowly defined, and I think it is. But then you go to Germany and you drink Pils from 4 different breweries, and they're different.
They're different, absolutely.
So it's just kind of funny. Yes, you can sit there and go, German Pils is this. It's bitter, it's cracker. It's bready. It has a little bit of sulfur, and it has
noble hop character.
Noble hop character.
Yeah.
And then you go try them, and it's like, well, they're all different.
Yeah,
and there's this, So yes, I do think that it is more narrowly defined, certainly because Asahi Super Dry next to Corona, they're fairly different.
Yeah, exactly. And I again, like I said, that to me that makes it kind of fun. A fun style for homebrewers especially, but for anybody who wants to dabble in messing around with these types of styles. So, well, when it comes to brewing this international pale lager in general, what might we expect in terms of ingredients? We can start talking about malt.
You should have malt. I would add some.
Maybe a little bit.
Yeah. So it's actually fairly simple. It's usually just a 2-row, whatever the local 2-row is. So it tends not to be 6-row unless they were importing it for some reason.
Well, there's a difference between American premium then, right? Because they're using fairly large charges of 6-row.
Yeah, I mean, so some do use 6-row for the fact of bringing enzymes to the party. Because, 6-row has more surface area to starch ratio. So you do bring those, more enzymes in and more ability to attenuate. And some of that might be lacking if you have all 2-row and a high amount of adjunct.
Yeah.
Right. So some do, to be fair, but I would imagine, most don't, just because if it's expensive to unless you're growing it. But there's not a lot of 6-row grown.
Yeah.
But if you're not using 6-row, then you could be using enzyme. So some of these places, to make a super dry beer, are not only mashing low and long, they could be adding enzyme to get highly attenuated, if that's the style you're going for, if you're going for a very dry beer.
Yeah, and my understanding when it comes to malt is this is one of the simplest grists that you're gonna utilize when making a beer. It's probably going to be 2-row Pilsner malt, low kilned,
and maybe some caramel. If so, like Red Stripe, probably has some caramel malt in it.
Or caramel coloring, something
certainly, our caramel coloring.
But exactly.
But we're talking like 2 to 5% max, and it's probably closer to 2.
Yeah.
If you're gonna do like a super dry or a beer Moretti, it might be some corn and some 2-row, maybe a 6-row mix if you want to get that graininess.
Yeah.
And then sugar, maybe maybe just dextrose.
That's what I read. I did very little research on. I'll talk about my experience brewing one of these in a bit, but I did very little research on international pale lager brewing because it's such a broad style. I felt like I could nail it fairly simply anyways. But one thing that I did read was that you can have some of these breweries are going to use actual flaked maize or corn. They're going to use flaked rice or rice solids and all of this stuff. But a lot of them are literally just tossing in basically 100% fermentable simple sugar to drive that attenuation. And which again, what an easy, fun way to brew a beer if you like the style. So we're talking. I think you can if you're throwing a dart, you're going to get close to the bullseye if you're hitting international pale lager with just Pilsner malt and maybe 15 to 20% simple sugar or rice or corn, something along those lines. Maybe a little charge of like C20 or lower crystal malt.
Yeah, I mean it could quite literally. It could be all malt. It could be all pills. It could be pills with a little bit of sugar for attenuation. It could be pills with a little bit of rice.
Yeah,
it could be pills with a little bit of corn. And then maybe a few percentage of a crystal, a low crystal. Wouldn't go above 30 for sure, but probably like in the 15 range.
Yeah.
Or you could use caramel coloring. And that's what's neat about it. You can kind of just do what
exactly.
you want. Certain styles tend to be kind of grainier. I find the Latin American ones tend to be a little more corny sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Asian ones tend to be a little more dry with a snappy high carb bitterness.
Yep.
So it's regional,
Yeah.
One of the hard parts is getting a good example of one, first of all, if you're not in that country. But if you find a good example of one, just taste it and use your palate and take some notes and try to emulate it.
Yeah. I'll be honest with you. I've never had an Asahi Super Dry that I thought was bad. But I don't know if it's because they're brewing it, their process is so good or whatever. But
I think it's because you're probably, I'm not sure, but you're probably drinking them in an area and in a location that has a high velocity. So the beer is cranking through.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I'm usually at a teppanyaki table or eating sushi, with my family. So, and everyone's got one on the table. So now let's talk a little bit about hopping. My understanding is that this is one of those styles where you're throwing an early hop addition at the beer, basically just to get the bitterness out of it. Like you mentioned, you can go with a little bit of a late addition, later hop addition, kettle hop addition. You're not going to be dry hopping these beers though. And they're not known for being terribly hop forward.
No, yeah. Some places actually use extract. So they use extract to reduce vegetal matter and improve kettle yield. So you can use extract if you want, or you can use a high alpha neutral hop like Magnum. Just get like a few IBUs. Probably 10 to 20 on your 60-minute addition, and then some will utilize a late addition. And if you're like a traditional German brewer, it's probably gonna be like a 15-minute boil. And some places will follow that formula to drive off the grassiness. But you can also, I tend to like a little fresh hop character in mine, so I'll do like a 10-minute addition or a 5-minute addition. We're talking like a half ounce max, maybe 3/4 if you're trying to be aggressive,
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's it. So for like for most 5-gallon batches, I think I use like an ounce to ounce and a half, ounce and a quarter of like a low, like a Saz,
low alpha,
noble,
yeah.
So obviously half that if you're in like the 6 alpha acid range, because a lot of Saz is like 3 to 4 alpha acid percent. So if you give a bigger, hop, adjust by, you could do like an alpha weight correction. So you take a weight in the alpha acids, and you kind of adjust it that way.
Yeah.
I just use brewing software.
The idea, my understanding again, is to not, you want to get the bitterness and maybe what I refer to as just a basic hop character, which is, I call it what you want. To me, it's a kind of a floral, spicy, noble,
exactly.
Mix.
It's like a generic hoppiness,
exactly,
without any defining character.
But just to make the beer taste like beer, not necessarily to make it the hops stand out in any way whatsoever.
Makes it balance the drink too.
Exactly. So the hopping thing is very easy. You might go with, I think this is another. Again, this style is an easy one. If you wanted to use high alpha early and then load up with maybe a little bit of a noble hop or something more spicy. I mean, even like I could see Crystal or something working really well at the 15 to 20 minute mark. Just enough again to get that IBU out of it with getting a little bit of that hop character. And then you're going to ferment this beer typically with a clean lager yeast at cool temperatures. That's the typical approach you can use. I have no idea what the Japanese brewers are using, if there's a strain that they're using specifically to drive that attenuation. Maybe Malcolm?
Asahi has a special yeast. I think it's proprietary, and they filter it out. And so they have a yeast that's called like Asahi 318 famously, So I don't know what that's based off of. They may have taken that from somewhere else and then, made it their own. But typically it's a fairly neutral, highly attenuative lager strain that performs well at cold temperatures,
Yeah.
And they're filtering, so I don't even know, I'm not even aware of the flocculation characteristics. A lot of lager yeasts are fairly powdery.
Yeah.
So they're probably centrifuging and filtering.
But if you're gonna make it for yourself at home, you can use any of the common lager yeast out there. The Weihenstephan strain, which is Imperial's Global, the Pilsner Urquell strain or Urquell, anything like that's going to get you where you want to go.
I mean, Urquell can work, but Urquell is the Bavarian strain, right?
It's the Pilsner Urquell strain. Yeah.
So I would go Harvest or K Bueno or Global.
Yeah. Anything that's going to drive a clean fermentation character, and not leave esters and phenols behind necessarily. And so one way to do that traditionally, again, is to ferment at a cooler temperature, 50 degrees Fahrenheit or cooler. That's 10 degrees C. Let's spend the last part of this segment talking a little bit about the traditional brewing process for making a light lager. First off, we haven't talked about water chemistry yet. I don't know if there is. Again, I'm thinking in terms of of this style having kind of a range in terms of pretty much everything. Mm-hmm. Is there a water chemistry or a water profile that you tend to prefer, or that you would go with in making this style?
I would go, like if I was using tap water, first of all, try to find out where you're starting from before you start giving someone directions.
Yeah, sure.
So I would take my water profile and dilute it with RO or distilled to try to get it in the low single digits or, low double digits. So like 10 to 20, sometimes you want your, people say calcium 50 grams, whatever, or 50 ppm.
Yeah.
So I think you're probably fine, if you went more Pilsen-esque here, because you don't want a lot of character. Most of these beers are not defined by their water character. What they are defined by is a crisp dryness.
Exactly.
In some cases. So if anything, I would use RO or DI and then add a little bit of maybe just a couple grams each of calcium sulfate, calcium chloride, just to get my calcium up.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would dilute my water down to get 20 to 50 ppm max of those minerals. So if you're in an area that has like in the 75s to hundreds of sulfate or chloride, dilute that down. What's the brewing water? I'd probably use like a pale and balanced.
So you're aiming for more of a balanced thing. I've learned this is. I feel like I got an email just the other day from somebody saying, hey, in this episode you mentioned this beer that you made, but you didn't talk about your reason for choosing the water profile you went with. And my response is because I really truly feel, given the impact that water chemistry really does have on the overall sensory components of beer, that there's a huge subjective component to it. You can make, well, well, we've seen it with American IPA and then the New England IPA, or West Coast IPA, I should say. High sulfate, you're going to get more of that crisp, punchy hop character. Higher chloride, you're going to get that more rounded, quote unquote, juicy character. It really does seem to have an impact, and choose what you want from that beer. Again, with International Pale Lager, if you want to go for a more rounded malt character, I think you can aim for a little bit higher calcium chloride to sulfate. Whereas for me, if I'm making this style, when I have any pale lager of any sort, I want it to be crisp and just like leave my mouth feeling super dry and refreshed. And to me, I get that when I use a higher ratio of gypsum to chloride. So, but yeah, I'm with you on that. I probably would go for more of the bitter character just so I'm getting more of that higher gypsum or higher calcium sulfate punch. But again, you can choose what you want in this one. Those are our opinions. In terms of mashing, a lot of people, when it comes to dry pale lagers, I think are pushing more of a longer mash rest, up to 90 minutes, maybe even 2 hours. The traditional thing for most homebrewers, I think, is 60 minutes, but you can go a little bit longer to drive attenuation, right?
Yeah. The longer you go, you have the chance of the enzymes going to limit attenuation, for that malt, for that temperature. So you can certainly try to extend it. You'll see diminishing returns.
Yeah. But it's a common thing you hear about is longer mashes for these types of styles, and then you take that wort, you take it to a boil. Of course, if you're using a high proportion of Pilsner malt, you're going to want to boil for an absolute minimum of 90 minutes or so, we've been told. And so that's a typical process when making this or any other type of lager is at least a 60-minute boil, but you can go up to 90 minutes or longer. You take that wort, you're going to chill it as quickly as possible. Of course, you don't want to pitch until that wort is down to at least 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees C. As we discussed earlier, pitch a nice big, healthy pitch of yeast that you've built up in a yeast starter. So because your cooler fermentations are going to demand healthier and more viable yeast. Yeah.
So typically you'll see like a lot of these yeast calculators will say 1.25 to 1.5, million cells per degree Plato per ml.
Yeah.
So you can use a calculator if you want to do that. If you use one pack of, say, imperial, if that's what you're using, imperial yeast, maybe use 2 packs, because you want almost twice the pitch rate of your typical ale
fermentation. I think that's the common recommendation.
Yeah.
And then once that beer is done fermenting, now you'll hear some people saying that they'll ramp the temp up to maybe 55, 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 12 or 13 degrees C, for a diacetyl rest. But you don't want it to get too warm for fear of imparting the beer with esters and undesirable flavor characteristics. But once it's done, then you're gonna you have to get that beer. When you think of International Pale Lager, there are no excuses for having a hazy International Pale Lager. So you got to do certain things to get that beer as clear as possible. I think typically for commercial breweries, they are filtering these beers to make them just absolutely bright. On the homebrew scale, of course, you can filter if you so desire, but you can also do a couple of other things. One of them is lager that beer for a long time to allow all the particulate to drop out, or you can use certain acceptable finings, biofine clear, clarity firm, or gelatin. Are there any other ways that you can think of getting a beer like this absolutely bright?
So kettle finings for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Before that, during your mash, if you do a step mash, you have a chance of breaking down more proteins, so that's less proteins to come over to create a polyphenol protein haze. Mm-hmm. So your mashing regimen can be adjusted to maximize clarity. Mm-hmm. And then, obviously, I said extract versus hop matter. So hop matter will bring polyphenols, which has a chance of creating polyphenol protein complexes. So minimizing your hops. And then I said kettle finings, so that could be carrageenan or a Brutan B or something like that.
Yeah.
To help give you a more dense whirlpool if you're whirlpooling sediment. So you have like a nice tight cone at the end of your whirlpool.
Drop out more of that kettle trube.
Yeah, bring less stuff over.
Yeah, absolutely. And then once that beer is done, once it's cleared up and it's done, fermentation is complete, you package it, you carbonate it. I tend to think that International Pale Lagers, one of the things that they all share is they do tend to be fairly well carbonated, probably in the range of 2.5 to 2.7 volumes, Malcolm?
Yeah. Most of them are in the 2.5 range. A lot of packaging equipment has trouble much above 2.5 to 2.6, so it's probably close to there.
Yeah. And if you're kegging your own, you have a little bit more leeway there. I like mine. I like most of my lagers to be fairly well carbonated as well. And then, of course, I think the final, the exclamation point is that it has to be served with some really good food or in really good company. Would you agree with me?
Yeah. Well, I think good company makes everything taste better.
Absolutely.
So, served cold too. They tend to be served cold.
Ice cold, right? Yeah.
Ice cold. Yeah.
This is one of those styles that first off, I think most beer drinkers, whether they're into craft beer or not, tend to enjoy these styles, and those are the types of folks who also really enjoy ice cold beer. So you serve it that way, and I actually agree on that one. So I've brewed a ton of pale lager in my day, and while I may have used some ingredients and methods that could have placed it in the international pale lager category, I've never intentionally brewed that style until recently. And of course, being my first go at the original IPL, if you will, I figured I'd see how one made using short and shoddy methods would turn out. More on that when we return. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. BrewersFriend.com offers everything needed by brewers of all levels, from the novice to the seasoned professional, including their feature-packed recipe builder that allows brewers to track their progress and record all data to improve brewing consistency. Brewers Friend also offers a slew of new features to cater to the professional brewing industry, such as groups, which allow multiple users to access one brewery account, tank tracking, which tracks the current status of any vessel, as well as inventory projections and custom alerts. Head over to BrewersFriend.com now and use code PODCAST at checkout to save 10% on your membership. Again, that's code PODCAST at BrewersFriend.com. When dumping wort-soaked grain in leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, did you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge, and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. Over the years, I've consumed many different versions of beers that fall under the International Pale Lager umbrella: Red Stripe, Corona, Heineken, Grolsch, Asahi, Sapporo, and so many more. Despite originating from different countries, there are a few things that they all share, namely pale-colored, light-bodied, and supremely drinkable. Rather than seeking out someone else's clone version of their favorite international pale lager, which you can absolutely do, just hit the Googs, I went into designing my recipe kind of blind, relying on my past experiences with this style. So what I ended up going with for this, first off, I brew in a bag, full volume brew in a bag. So I'm using all of the brewing liquor, typical brew in a bag setup on my electric SS Brewtech 1V system. I actually started this from the very beginning at 3:46 p.m. on one, I believe it was a Sunday afternoon. Collected the full volume of water, which I do filter because I do have some chlorine in my water. I completely forgot to adjust with minerals. I usually just throw in when I'm doing these short and shoddy batches, I'll just throw in a handful of gypsum or calcium chloride. I actually just forgot to do that for this batch. And then I set the controller to heat up the water. At this point, I proceeded to weigh out and mill the very, very simple grist. It was just 95% Pilsner malt. And then I tossed in 5% table sugar during the boil. So very, very simple. Single infusion mash at 150 degrees Fahrenheit or 66 degrees C for a whopping 25 minutes. So a far cry from the 90 minutes that a lot of, lager brewers are doing for these styles. I removed the grain bag after 25 minutes, and I did give it a nice squeeze just to achieve my pre-boil volume. And then I set the controller to heat it up to a boil. Once it reached a boil, I did add a dose of a Magnum, 12 grams of Magnum at 20 minutes, just to get the main portion of my bitterness. And then with 15 minutes left, I added 30 grams of Tettnang. Now, this was 2019 that I was brewing this beer, and sitting in the back of my fridge was a well-sealed, or not my fridge, my freezer, a well-sealed bag of 2017 Tettnang. So I went ahead and used that, thinking, hey, this is a short and shoddy. Might as well see where this goes. Added 30 grams of that at 15 minutes left in the boil, and then I added the sugar, that 5% sugar dose. I think it was about a pound at 10 minutes left in the boil. With the boil complete, I chilled the wort using my Mycilla from Jaded Brewing, chilled it to a few degrees above groundwater temperature, which, given the time that I was brewing this, I believe it was in July, ended up being around 74 degrees Fahrenheit or 23 degrees C. Without waiting for all of that trub to settle out, I immediately racked the wort to a sanitized fermenter, and then didn't really wait much longer before pitching the yeast. And in this one, I pitched Imperial Yeast's L28 Urkel, which is purportedly the Pilsner Urquell strain. Again, that went directly into the wort that was 74 degrees Fahrenheit, 23 degrees C. The OG of the wort was 1047, which for this short and shoddy thing, and this is pretty consistent for me, meant that I was at about 59% brewhouse efficiency with a mash efficiency of 62%. Not terrible, right? I mean, for a 25-minute mash.
Yeah, that's about what I would expect. 60 to 70, sure. It's not bad.
It's interesting. If I just to kind of spin off on the whole mash length thing, if I go 30 minutes in the mash, that bumps up to about 64% brewhouse efficiency, mash efficiency about 66, 67. If I go an hour, it bumps up to about 70% brewhouse efficiency with about 74, 75% mash efficiency. So it's I've done this enough to where it's fairly predictable, and I'm perfectly fine. We just recently did an episode on efficiency, is why I'm bringing this up. I'm perfectly fine with the 59 to 62% if my brew day is taking, is way less time than before. So I'm cool with it. If you're not, you might want to mash longer. But the beer was then, the beer filled fermenter was then placed in my chamber, which was controlled to 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 C, which is my standard ale fermentation temperature. At this point, it was 5:39 p.m. for a total brew day length of 1 hour and 53 minutes, including cleanup, which takes me about 15 minutes. I was just over 2 hours. Not too shabby, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't know.
I know you just love this, Malcolm.
I love it because it's just kind of fun to give you a hard time. But I just don't see, I would find something else to do. Like, I'd put my shoes on and get ready and mash for another 20 or 30 minutes. I totally get it. I love it. But I'm just like, what the hell? Hey, and I'm also like, man, use some new hops. I mean, it's the one thing you got in this beer it's like you have a 2017 Tettnang. You can minimize the shoddy, is what I'm saying.
Oh, but that's what makes it so fun, Malcolm. Is bugging people like you.
I love you. Yeah, I love it. Go for it.
So I did ferment. I'm fermenting in a Spike Flex Plus fermenter, which I can.
Why not ferment it in a paint bucket,
or old shoes or something, right?
Yeah, old shoes. Dump the flour out that your daughter grew at school. One of those
without cleaning
boot
it.
potters. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, somebody once told me that this is short and shoddy. You should be fermenting in an unsanitized, old, scratched up carboy or whatever. That's not the purpose of this whole thing. You can. The idea here is look at what you can get away with if you've got other good things in place. I actually love convenience. I feel like there's more value in convenience than there is in a lot of other things. And the Flex Plus is a very, very convenient rig. I mean, you can do all kinds of cool stuff, which I did on this batch, and I'll get into that.
It's awesome. It's awesome looking, and the fact that you haven't painted it like R2D2 is a sin.
It does look like. Well, I'm not. hey, listen, little secret. I am not a Star Wars guy, and I love the people who are. My brain doesn't work that way. I'd rather watch a documentary than that kind of stuff. But that's neither here nor there. I did connect the fermenter to my cool little CO2 capture rig. So basically, I've talked about this in a past episode as well, where the naturally produced CO2 from fermentation pushes out sanitizer that's in one keg into a secondary keg, and then fills that, in essence, purging the primary keg there with CO2. And then I eventually end up racking the beer into that purged keg. So there's no oxygen contact, ostensibly, at all. So, which is pretty cool. So I did connect it. Fermentation kicked off. Oh, by the way, I only pitched a single pouch of the Imperial Urquell. I did not prop it up in a starter. Now, the yeast was fresh, of course, but single pouch.
It's 200 billion cells compared to a lot of the competitors.
That's true.
100.
And also, I am fermenting. I fermented it at 66 degrees, pitched at 74 degrees Fahrenheit. So a lot working in my favor in terms of the fermentation there, at least for the sake of the yeast's health. Now, who's to say if it wouldn't, just produce an ester bomb, of course. But I did leave the beer to ferment for 9 days before it started showing signs of fermentation. Took a hydrometer measurement at this point, and it showed the beer reached a fairly low, and I was happy with this 1005 FG. Not a bad FG for an international pale lager that I was hoping would be fairly dry. Now, I did kind of, when I was designing this beer, it didn't take much work, to be honest with you, but I was kind of aiming for something along the lines of an Asahi Super Dry.
Yeah, I probably would have went with some more sugar, or rice, but I think it meets the. It looks like it's fairly close. What was your calculated IBU?
I think it was around 21 IBU, 21, something like that.
Yeah, right in that area, I would say, is for Asahi, 25 maybe at the max. But yeah, this looks like it could, other than the yeast. I think you used the wrong yeast, but whatever,
Well, I did a lot wrong on this batch, Malcolm. That was the point, man. I used the yeast that I had left in my fridge, to be honest with you. I just went with whatever lager yeast I had in there. So that happened to be the Urquell. So at this point, I reduced the temperature with the 1005 FG. I reduced the temperature of the chamber to 33 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree C. And when I do this using the Flex, I do connect exogenous CO2 so that it doesn't suck in. The Flex Plus, it would just create a small vacuum, but I want CO2 to go in. So I just, 1 PSI of CO2 during the cold crash. After 2 days, I did add gelatin fining. A lot of people ask me in my attempt to try to reduce oxygen contact, how do I add gelatin? I literally just very gently open the top of the fermenter and pour it in, and then I do that while the CO2 is still pumping to kind of push out. I guess it's kind of wishful thinking, but push out any of the oxygen that I might be introducing. Anyway, so I did that. I let the beer mingle with the gelatin for 4 more days before proceeding with racking it to a purged keg. Again, this is all done relatively hands off when I'm using this particular setup. I push CO2 into the Flex Plus, and then I rack the beer out of the bottom of the fermenter and directly into a keg that's all sealed off, pushing any of the CO2 that is in the keg out of the gas post. And that works really well for me. It only takes about 7 or 8 minutes, which compared to my old way of kegging, again, convenience has value to me. The kegged beer was then placed in my keezer and burst carbonated overnight before the way I burst carbonate nowadays is 50 psi for 12 to 15 hours, and then I knock it down to about 14 psi, and I'll usually let the beers condition for 2 or 3 days before I start sampling them. In this case, it was about 13 days before I was able to find the time to serve them to tasters, and that's what I did. So 13 days, about 2 weeks in the keg on gas before I serve them to tasters. Now, if you take a look at the picture, you will see that there's a little bit of condensation on the glass, but underneath that condensation is an absolutely crystal clear pale yellow beer with a stark white cap of foam.
Don't believe you at all.
Well, that's fine. But to me, it looked exactly like you expect if you pour out a bottle of Asahi into a glass at the sushi bar. So I was pleased from that perspective.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I don't understand why you can't let the glass warm up
You're so critical of me, Malcolm.
My job is to give you a hard time, so I think I'm double downing on this episode. It's been too long.
I know, man. So, it has been too long. My
right.
personal impressions of this beer, I actually haven't used sugar very much in my brewing. It's not because I have anything against it, but most of the styles that I make don't typically call for it. So I was probably, at this point, I've brewed a lot of short and shoddy, so I was a bit more concerned about the sugar addition and what that might contribute than I was the process stuff. Seriously, this beer came out so incredibly good. I actually shocked myself on this one. It was crisp, clean, it cleared up, it was dry as a bone. There were no esters or phenols that I could detect at all. One of the easiest drinking beers that I've made to date. I absolutely loved it, and I actually drank some of it just on my own next to an Asahi that I got at the store, so I'm sure there was some age on it or whatever. I loved the Asahi, but I preferred mine over that. They were so incredibly similar, though.
That's wild. Yeah, I think so. These are one of my favorite beers to make. You know, I know you can go buy them at the store fairly cheap, but when people come over and you offer them 4 beers, unless they're a very craft-centric person, it's like they'll take the IPA or the pale ale you have on, or they go to the American Light Lager or the International Pale.
Absolutely.
Almost every single time.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the easy drinking beer preference thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll be, upfront, this beer did not last very long. Everybody who came over, I only had 3 or 4 beers on at the same time, but everybody who came over was drinking that one and asking for seconds and thirds. And, the ABV, I think, what did that come out to? I think
low 5s.
Yeah. Low 5s,
yeah.
I believe. And
if I make these, I always find myself making food to go with it. It's like, I made like a, Latin American inspired, pale lager, with like Mexican yeast and corn. I guess we're having tacos for like the next week, if it's like yours, like the Asahi, it's like, I'm making sushi at home and I'm making pho and I'm making ramen, it's like,
I know what I'm doing for lunch today. Good Lord.
Yeah.
So I did serve this beer to 23 tasters. Now, I think this was the first time that the tasters got the new survey. I've talked about this in past Short and Shoddy episodes. We are now telling people up front what the style is so that when they're doing their evaluation, they're evaluating it relative to the style. And I also include the BJCP general description of the style so they have something to kind of anchor it to. That was something that a lot of readers and listeners were telling us, just let people know the style for this one. I agree. I feel like the data has been better, more interesting at the very least.
I'm so torn on that because I think they'll find what you told them, but whatever.
Well, you'll see that they don't typically do that. In this one, it might be a little bit more weighted, but the thing is, a lot of people seem to think that we use the same tasters over and over and over again. That's just not the case at all. There are thousands of beer drinkers and home brewers and craft beer lovers here in Fresno alone. So 23 tasters, though. In terms of how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters seem to perceive the strongest of those characteristics as being the beer's dryness, which to me was so satisfying to see. It yielded an average rating of about 3.7 out of 5. Pretty doggone high, if you ask me. The next one was malty, and hoppy came in as a distant third. To me, that lines up really, really well with what you would expect, just overall for an international pale lager.
Yeah, you could almost draw like an expectation curve, and that's what it would be.
Exactly.
So
dry
cool. Yeah.
with maybe a little malty and not very hoppy at all. And to me, I'm thinking, all right, this is working out for me. I would have rated it the same way. I don't take these surveys, of course. In terms of breaking down those characteristics, so the characteristics that come from each of those other descriptors, the tasters rated for hop character, the most prominent hop characteristic, 6 out of 23 felt that it was floral, which makes sense. And now mind you, hoppiness was ranked the lowest of hop, malty, and dryness. So they're really
what they get from that minor amount.
Exactly. They're really digging for something. And so 6 out of 23 went with floral. That's almost 25%. Another 5 each ranked earthy, melon, and fruity. So those characteristics got ranked by 5 people. And then 1 person each rated pine and resinous and spicy. I tossed in a 30-gram charge at 15 minutes of Tettninger, which to me is a fairly pungent floral/earthy kind of hop. I don't know. I didn't quite pick up on it coming through very strongly. If I were to pick one, I would have probably gone with floral as well.
Yeah, I would have expected more floral spice, but I didn't have that beer. But I wonder, you just previously said there was no ester character. Well, there was ester character, right? Because it's beer.
Absolutely,
I know you were being demonstrative, but so there was esters. So because these beers often, especially if they get a little bit warm, they kind of go, apple pear. So they may have gotten a little bit of ester and called that hoppy.
Sure. Yeah, that's absolutely possible.
Never know for sure. But.
Yeah. Well, when they did the malt breakdown, 15 out of 23 people went with cracker bread crust. I mean, to me, that was it was 100% cracker bread crust. 4 people felt that the caramel sweet was the strongest malt characteristic. Makes sense to me. I feel like some people separate the caramel from the sweet there, and not because there was sugar in it, but because of the alcohol ester. I feel like that kind of imparts just a general sweetness to the beer, which is quite pleasant. You've talked about that before, Malcolm.
Yeah, absolutely. The interaction between alcohol. I mean, there's an alcohol component to esters, anyways. But a little bit of alcohol sweetness paired with some of those esters can come across differently, and that's some of the belief behind like the green apple note of some of the domestics. They're controlling for acetaldehyde or acetaldehyde. So. There's not a lot in there, but people will swear up and down Budweiser, acetaldehyde.
I know.
No, probably not.
No, I don't think so either. Yeah. But it does have that apple pear thing going on. Yeah.
So it's probably some amount of ester in the presence of alcohol. You know, and that's the other thing too. Is I said the apple pear. Another one tends to be like red licorice. For these type of beers, you get a little bit of this red licorice, grape, red vine ester character, and it's in small amounts. Or strawberry.
I can't say I've ever noticed that.
Yeah, in small amounts for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think the one that maybe some of our listeners are probably the most anxious to hear about is the yeast character, given the fact that I fermented this, very, very supposedly clean pale lager with a traditional, lager strain at 66 degrees Fahrenheit. 17 out of 23 tasters felt that the most prominent fermentation character was clean. I would put myself in that group as well. 3 felt that there were some esters there. 2 thought that there was some sulfur, which I feel like sulfur, small amounts of sulfur is perfectly appropriate in this style. I didn't detect any sulfur in it. And I think one person went with phenols. So largely, a huge majority felt that the fermentation character was clean. This is something over and over and over again that I know that it's bucking a major trend. Like I'm kind of the scapegoat when people like to diss me for this. I feel like a lot of lager yeast developed a reputation because people were using it one way, and then that meant that you have to do that. But I think they're a lot more robust than we've given them credit for, and that's been my experience. So to me, the fermentation character on this was very, very clean. Malcolm, you've fermented beers warm with different lager strains. I don't know what your experience is with it, but
yeah, I find in some cases with some strains that it's counterintuitive. Like you sit there and you grow a lager yeast at warm temperatures, and because it's in that growth phase, it's not producing esters. So you have this rapid growth of yeast. It's not producing esters, and then it's done.
Yeah.
So you've kicked it out, and then if you raise the temperature a little bit, it does its job of now reducing VDK, your diacetyl, and your acetaldehyde. So you end up with a fairly clean fermentation. Sometimes too clean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I've had it go the other way, where I have made an estery lager by doing this, but I usually cover it up with hops and call it,
hoppy lager.
Poppy lager. But so I think it's really just strain dependent. I think it has to do with growth, and it has to do with nutrients.
Yeah.
And I can't put my finger on one thing.
I do think there's an element of strain dependence as well, and that we're learning a lot about the different types of lager yeast that there are, and we've done some experiments. We've done multiple with the Urkel strain, the Pilsner Urkel strain, that seems to really suggest it's very robust. You can ferment it at 48 or 68, and you're going to get the same perceptible same characteristic.
Same thing with 3470.
Yeah, exactly. Weihenstephan.
Yeah. That, especially off of Gen 2, Gen 1 sometimes not as good performance. Gen 1 seems to give me a lot of sulfur. Not always, but, once again, pitch rate, beer dependent. But Weihenstephan strain, man, that thing is, people say it's a hybrid anyways, so it just seems to be like easy mode lager brewing.
I know. I agree. And just to clarify, I think I might have misspoke earlier. 3 people said phenols for the yeast character. 1 person went with esters. So, all right. In terms of off flavors, only 1 person noted anything. And knowing that this was a lager, it doesn't surprise me. They ticked DMS. That seems to be one of the off flavors I actually am relatively sensitive to, and I got absolutely zero corny or ketchupy flavor out of this beer. But 1 out of 23, that seems pretty good odds that there may have been nothing there. And then one of the questions that I like a lot is we ask tasters, how well does this beer represent the style? And they get to rate it on a 0 to 5 scale. There's, I guess, room for interpretation in what those numbers represent. But 9 out of the 23 people felt that it was a spot on example and rated it a 5 out of 5 in terms of representativeness to style. I think that might be the highest that we've ever gotten, a 5 out of 5, the most people who rank a 5 out of 5. That basically is saying that this is a spot on, perfect example of International Pale Lager. And then 12 more people gave it a 4 out of 5. So altogether, we're looking, 21 people. 21 people of the 23 felt that this was a very, very good example of an International Pale Lager. I don't know if that's a function of this more broad understanding of what that style represents, but I was pretty happy with those results.
Yeah. First, I want to touch on the DMS character. Not necessarily a fall International Pale Lager. A lot of people do believe that a little bit of DMS is one of the components of lager character.
Sure,
so
yeah.
We can go round and round on that. But a little bit of DMS, not a fault. In fact, it could very well be done on purpose to give it that lagerness. You know, some people, I've even heard some German brewers say DMS gives a roundness of flavor and palate. Like, it makes the beer feel more round in flavor, so it's not all cracker.
Yeah.
And bread and dry. So that's something I heard, a little bit recently from some classically trained German brewers, which I found very interesting.
Yeah.
Secondly, that's the first thing that stuck out to me is what you said, the preference and the style representation. Those are the highest I've seen it.
Oh yeah, I've never, and these are not like friends of mine who are doing this. Usually my data collection for the short and shoddy is go to Pendragon, drink beer with people I don't know, and ask them if they'll drink my beer and evaluate it for free. The fact that they're sitting in a craft beer bar typically means that they at least are thoughtful about styles. On this one, again, we're not hiding the style from evaluators anymore. So beforehand, I'm telling them, you've had Asahi, you've had a Corona, you've had Red Stripe. All of these are examples of an International Pale Lager. I brewed this beer to be sort of like that. Let me know what you think. And the fact that they're rating, 21 people, 4 out of 5 or higher, that's pretty astonishing. One each did endorse 3 and 2 out of 5. Nobody gave it anything lower than a 2 out of 5 in terms of representativeness. So again, pretty stoked. You mentioned preference. Another best yet for the short and shoddy series. 8 out of 23 people rated this one as being a 5 out of 5 in terms of preference. 8 out of 23 people basically are sitting there saying, I could drink this all day long. It's that good. Another 7 gave it a 4 out of 5, and another 6 gave it a 3 out of 5. That right there, what are we at? 22 out of the 23 people, or 21 out of the 23 people are saying that this beer was that good. That's pretty cool.
I also like to point out that, you had 1 at 1 and 1 at 2.
Yeah.
I have never seen a preference rating where it's 100%, unless it's like, do you want to eat a turd? You're
going to find somebody who says yes, I promise you.
Yeah, you might, given the right crowd.
Yeah.
So I just want to say, if you're reading studies and things online, if someone says, oh, and everyone loved this, bullshit.
Yeah, till we're blue in the face.
Yeah.
Subjectivity, preference is subjective. Preference is subjective. We say it till we're blue in the face. There are people who just don't like this style and only want to drink hazy, creamy IPA. So my overall thoughts, on this beer, on this experience making this, it's not very common that I'll say it, but I cannot think of a single thing that I didn't enjoy about this beer. It had everything I expect from an International Pale Lager, and on top of that, it was equally as satisfying. Like I mentioned, I tasted this next to Asahi Super Dry. I was just as satisfied with my homemade version as I was with that. Yet again, the short and shoddy methods didn't really seem to have a negative impact, at least according to the tasters and my own impression. I definitely will brew this again. I definitely recommend anyone out there who is interested in having just a crushable, clean, dry pale lager on to give this a shot, and you can do it in under 2 hours. Malcolm, is this? I know I have a good feeling that you're not going to go and brew a 2-hour International Pale Lager, but what do you think?
No, I would try anything twice. So I'd probably mash a little bit longer, but I'd be willing to try it this way and go, I'm not really against it. I just enjoy brewing a certain way.
Yeah.
And I would certainly try it, with minor tweaks.
That's the thing. You can take this, what I've done, the craziness that I've done, and say, well, if I can get eke a little bit more extraction out of doing a 60-minute mash, and I have the time to do it, then that's what I'll do. Change it as you will. What I'm saying is, without doing any of that, approaching this thing as blasphemously as I did, it still produced a damn good beer. And so that, which allows me to say, go make your little changes if you want to. You're probably still going to get away. Hey, maybe just take away from this that you can ferment with the Urquell strain at 66 degrees Fahrenheit and produce a really well-received, statistically well-received international pale lager. I think it's pretty cool. Well, we've got some reader comments I want to get to before we close this show out. Random Dumping said, a very nice write-up, thanks. You said you forgot to adjust the water, so I'm curious as to what the additions would have been for this style. Seems like this would be a common approach with all of the short and shoddy experiments, to quote, forget the water adjustments. I'd also like to see a plus or minus 10 degrees on the mash temp as well. That would make it interesting. I think we spent some time talking about what we think a decent water profile would be. Just to reiterate, I would go with something, maybe a chloride to sulfate ratio that's a bit lower, because I want that higher sulfate. Sounds like, Malcolm, you'd go with something that's balanced.
I would totally steer the beer. So if I was doing a super dry, I might go with unfiltered water with a little bit of calcium sulfate. If I was doing a Latin beer, I'd probably go for a little more fuller bodied, fuller flavor.
Sure.
And go balanced. If I were doing Middle Europe, it would depend on where.
Yeah.
So if it's I can't even think of an example right now off the top of my head, but like, some Ukrainian, local lager, if it tends to be dry, I would go dry with sulfate. If it was I don't know, Peroni. So Peroni tends a little bit more sweeter.
Yeah.
So
maybe higher chloride.
I'd probably go higher chloride or balanced.
Yeah.
But I would still stay low. I would still stay, in the 50s, 60s max ppm of all minerals, of each individual ion, I should say. So you're looking like 20 to 50 calcium, 20 to 50 sulfate, 20 to 50 chloride. So I would stay low.
Yeah.
And if I wasn't low, if my native water wasn't low, then I would dilute.
Yeah. We can geek out so hard on water chemistry. But that's what
it really steers the beer.
I absolutely agree with you, and I appreciate the question from Random Dumping.
And his name.
Yeah, interesting name. Ben Morgan says, this is now on my to brew list. Good for you, Ben. He says, I note you didn't get any, quote, spicy from the hops, though. Would you get that from a different noble hop? Malcolm, I know that there are certain hops out there. I tend to get more of a spicy note from sods, but also I didn't use enough, and I used it early enough in the boil that I'm just not sure it would extract that much spicy for this style.
Yeah, I wouldn't say Tettnanger is typically high on spice.
No.
But, it's just going to be one of those things where you have to kind of take the hop, open it, smell it, rub it, and depending on the year and depending on how fresh it is, that's what it's going to be, right?
Yeah,
so you tend to have a better chance of getting spice from sods, but I get a high amount of flour from sods too, so it's going to have to be one of those things where you have to open the hop up and smell it and rub it.
Yeah, and if you really want to get that noble hop character, whether it's spice or floral or whatever, you can absolutely, with this style, throw those hops in a larger charge at 5 minutes left in the boil. I mean, you're going to extract more of that hop aroma, that hop character. So
the less you boil it, you have a higher chance of bringing over some of the vegetative and grass notes. That's why a lot of German brewers will boil for at least 15. So you can mess with that. That's kind of another control level you have, a control, lever. So if you want more fresh hop character, higher charge or boil less time.
Yep.
It's just that simple.
Yep, absolutely. Final question comes from Andrew Perkins. How warm would you be willing to ferment this one? Clearly a question for Marshall here. I don't have a fermentation chamber, and I'm trying to find the best place in the house. Andrew, I get this question a lot. We've done experiments up to, we've done a couple that are kind of wonky and up in the 80 degree Fahrenheit range. But I'd be comfortable fermenting this one upwards to maybe about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is about 21 degrees Celsius. If you have a basement or a place in your house that maintains what we would call like ambient temperature between 20 degrees and 22 degrees C or 68 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit, I think you're probably going to be safe. Those are as big of a delta as those sound. They're really not that huge in the grand scheme of things. During the wintertime, I've talked to a lot of people who will place their fermenters next to like a cracked window in a closed off room just to kind of keep it cool during the wintertime. The nice thing about, at least for people like me who don't mind bucking trends, the nice thing about these short and shoddy experiences is they have shown that there are certain yeast strains, again, like we discussed earlier, that are very robust. So in addition to temperature, I would recommend maybe sticking with the Weihenstephan strain, which is Imperial's Urkel, or like 3470 for a dry version, or the Pilsner Urquell strain, or the Weihenstephan strain is global, not Urkel, and then the Pilsner Urquell is Urkel. I've also had a lot of luck with Harvest fermented warm, even though that experiment did produce a significant result. People were able to reliably distinguish between the warm fermented and the cool fermented beer. Most of those people in after the fact conversations said that the warm fermented one tasted more lagery. So go figure. Malcolm, you have any comments for Andrew?
3470. I think that's the global one.
Yeah, Weihenstephan.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
Weihenstephan. That's very forgiving. And then I wouldn't be against trying with the Kvike yeast. Especially like the Voss. It's not going to be the same, right? It's not going to be exactly the same, but you can get lager-esque characters if you don't go super hot. You pitch high, and you're going for low hop character and using spicy hops and you're using all Pilsner malt.
Yeah.
So I would say if you truly have no temperature control, if you go into a cool area or if you put it in a water bath to kind of maintain temperatures, you have a chance of making a good beer.
Absolutely. Yeah. And make sure that, I don't think anyone is going to argue, don't use healthy yeast. Make sure your yeast is relatively fresh, that you've treated it well, right. That you haven't, stored it in your back pocket for 2 weeks, whatever. So, well, like I said, I loved this beer, and the fact it only took 2 hours to brew, it made it even more cool, in my opinion. Again, if you're into this style, I recommend you give it a shot, maybe riff off of what I've done here. But that's all the time we've got for this episode. Malcolm, anything you want to leave our listeners with before we bounce?
No, try it. Simple.
It's so simple.
Yeah, simple.
And it's a great beer. It's an absolutely easy drinking beer. So remember to head over to brulosophy.com to read about the recipe discussed in this episode, as well as all of the other stuff we're up to. The Brulosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.